one of the gravest assaults ever made on the Japanese imperial institution, was launched by the Buddhist priest Dokyo in the 760s. Dokyo, who came from a clan of the low-ranking provincial aristocracy, gained the affection of the retired Empress Koken in 761 and proceeded to gather political power to himself. By the end of the decade he stood as the paramount figure in the court bureaucracy and had already begun to usurp imperial prerogatives. It was in 769 that an oracle from the shrine of Hachiman in Kyushu was reported to Nara. The god prophesied peace in the realm if Dokyo were proclaimed emperor. Koken, who had reascended the throne as Empress Shotoku, upon the advice of the god given her in a dream, dispatched Wake no Kiyomaru to Kyushu to ascertain Hachiman's true will. Kiyomaru returned to the capital with the famous oracle that read as follows: "Since the establishment of our state, the distinction between lord and subject has been fixed. Never has there been an occasion when a subject was made lord. The throne of Heavenly Sun's succession shall be given to one of the imperial lineage. Wicked persons should immediately be swept away." Although the priest took his vengeance upon Kiyomaru by exiling him to Osumi, Dokyo's own power soon dissolved, for the empress died in the following year and Dokyo was banished from the capital. He died 3 years later while serving in a lowly post at a temple in Shimotsuke. The Dokyo incident marks a colorful and crucial point in Japanese history, and can be fruitfully studied in many different ways. One might analyze the relations of the great clans of the Nara period and the contribution of factional struggles to Dokyo's rise. One might explore the pattern of female rule in early Japanese history and its demise in the Dokyo incident. The coup attempt might be studied solely out of fascination for the intriguing personalities involved. There are myriad possibilities. We will be concerned with the doctrinal threat which Dokyo's rise posed to the legitimacy of the Japanese imperial family. The primary focus of this inquiry will be an examination of the participation of the Hachiman belief in this crisis of legitimacy. The discussion will center on the question of how Hachiman, a formerly obscure god, came to be associated with political events of the Nara period and will attempt to deal with the problem of the significance of the deity's role in this crucial chapter of Japanese history. Who, then, was Hachiman, a deity so powerful that he could pronounce on the succession to the imperial throne? Why was he so greatly revered that it was necessary for imperial messengers to travel all the way from the political center of power in Nara to the northeast corner of Kyushu to ascertain his will? As one writer asks rhetorically, weren't there any gods in Nara? Hachiman is commonly identified as the Shinto god of war. This, for example, is the definition in Robert K. Reischau's reference work Early Japanese History, and he cites the worship of Hachiman by Minamoto generals. The Minamoto cult has likely been the most important source for this martial identification of Hachiman. When Basho visited a Hachiman shrine at Kurobane, his thoughts turned to the exploits of Nasuno Yoichi Munetaka, a Minamoto retainer who called on Hachiman at the Battle of Yashima in the final stages of the Genpei War. Japanese scholars, however, have looked beyond this medieval phase of the Hachiman cult and begun the task of interpreting earlier stages of the belief. A number of Western writers have also discovered the complexity of the faith. Yue Kazuo, despite the title of his article, Hachiman, the War God of Japan, concluded after a brief historical sketch and examination of the popular cult that the war god aspect was only part of the picture. Hachiman was to a great extent a protector and preserver of life in non-military contexts. Kazuo found, incidentally, that Hachiman's powers are so broad that women bring infants to the shrine to pray for protection against intestinal worms. Jean Herbert, proceeding from the present-day identification of Hachiman with Oji and Jingle at most shrines, discussed the Kojiki and Nihongi legends of these sovereigns. The resulting picture of Hachiman is one of an amorphous deity with myriad functions, and certainly this image contributes little to an understanding of the broader political significance of Hachiman in Japanese history. It is hoped that confining this essay primarily to an exploration of Hachiman as perceived by the Nara court will help to produce a clearer image of the deity and his political functions in the 8th century. The origin of the Hachiman cult. The Shoku Nihongi is the earliest official history to mention Hachiman. The name appears in neither Kojiki nor Nihongi. The Hachiman of Shoku Nihongi is enshrined at Usa in Buzen province on the northeast coast of Kyushu. Unfortunately, this chronicle contains no account of the foundation of the Usa shrine, and the earliest surviving legend of its origin dates from the 9th century. This legend concerns the first manifestation of Hachiman and appears in Usa, Engi, compiled by the governor of Buzen in 844. According to this account, an old blacksmith lived in the late years of Kime's reign, late 6th century, near a lake below Mtomoto in the Usa region. He was visited by a man named Omiwa, who stayed there for 3 years, spending his time in prayer. Then, in the 37th year of Kime's era, a golden hawk appeared to Omiwa. Swiftly the hawk transformed itself into a dove, which in turn changed into a young boy, who announced, "I am the 16th human emperor, Hamuda Tenno, the broad-bannered Hachiman." Mero. This account does not tell us much about the origin of the cult in question, and it is not surprising that Japanese scholars have doubts as to the significance of the myth. One authority suggests that the dating of the manifestation in Kemari's reign may connote an early association with Buddhism. It is not generally believed that the figure of Ojin, Hamuda Tenno, was associated with the Hachiman belief from its beginnings. Beyond the point that the references to the smith and to the possession of a child by a god suggest a shamanistic origin of the cult, there is probably little to be gained from an examination of this tale. However, within the last few decades a Japanese scholar has completed an extensive investigation into the origins of Hachiman, and the results of his study will be summarized briefly here. In Hachiman Shinkoshi no Kenkaku, Nakano Hatayoshi proceeded from the premise that the development of Shinto cannot be separated from the Shizoku society which produced it. Accordingly he studied the histories of the Uji clans, which are known from 9th century documents to have been connected with Hachiman, and attempted to produce a clearer picture of the early development of the cult. Nakano believes that the Hachiman faith did not originate exclusively at Usa, but was rather the result of a process of amalgamation of the Ujigami beliefs of various clans which finally found its center at the present shrine in Usa. The three clans whose deities were the principal constituents of this amalgam were the Usa clan, the Karajima clan, and the Omiwa clan. The Usa clan itself was the result of a union of clans, the most important of which was the Yama clan, which had worshipped a divine dragon king. A reverence for this deity was common among maritime peoples along the coast of Kyushu, but what distinguished the deity of the Usa clan was the animistic worship of three megaliths on the Maki peak of Mount Omoto. Although this would seem to indicate a phallic cult, the Usa clan god was actually identified as a female deity and had a maritime association, the rocks being used as guides to shipping. The area occupied by the Usa clan corresponded roughly to what became the southern half of the ancient province of Buzen and was termed Yamakuni in the clan histories. Nakano believes that the Karajima clan originated from a group of immigrants from Korea who worshipped a Korean deity. This tribe possessed bronze weapons and its religion was characterized by shamanistic elements such as the employment of miko, or mediums. The area which they originally occupied seems to have been the northern area of Buzen, identified as Toyokuni, but Nakano thinks that sometime between the 3rd and 6th centuries they pushed south and conquered the Usa people. Resulting from the Karajima move was a political union of the two major clans of the Yama and Toyo regions. At this point it is necessary to digress and comment on the name Hachiman. The ancient Japanese pronunciation of the characters was Yawata. This at any rate was the reading Mittori Norinaga gave them when he transcribed the imperial edicts of Shokuni Hongi. The characters mean literally 8 banners, and there are later legends which relate that at the founding of the Usa shrine 8 banners descended from heaven and planted themselves on the roof of the shrine. Kazel believes that the banners refer to a Chinese system of banner standards for troops and hence have a military significance, but the orthodox view is that the name is derived from an ancient place name and perhaps has an agricultural connotation derived from hatake, field. Miyagi Naokazu suggests Yokita. Kazel suggests Yahata. Nakano adheres to the place name theory but offers a rather novel explanation. As we have seen, the union of the Karajima and Usa clans resulted in a political union of the Yama and Toyo regions. This union also entailed a merger of the Ujigami of the two clans. The god who symbolized this political union, then, was Yama-Toyo, from which was eventually derived Yawata, later read Hachiman. Here it would be useful to summarize Nakano's picture of the early Hachiman as existing about the mid-6th century, by which time the first shrine had been established at Usa. The earliest phase of the faith had been a primitive animistic religion with maritime connotations, involving a female deity. This belief was overlaid by a shamanistic cult brought from Korea. The amalgam of beliefs was reflected in the new deity, Hachiman, who symbolized the political union between two clans. Associated with the cult was the memory of the conquest of one clan by the other. It is interesting to compare this picture with that presented by another legend of the origin of the god, a legend which dates from medieval times. This tradition relates the beginnings of the cult to the Kojiki story of Fire Shine and Fire Fade. According to this interpretation, Hiko Hohodemi, grandfather of Emperor Jimmu, represented the imperial ancestral clan in Kyushu. The dragon king god of the sea symbolized the Watatsumi clan, a maritime people living along the coast. In this account, Hiko Hohodemi married Toyotama Hime, the daughter of the sea god, and the resulting composite deity, including both figures, was Hachiman, who thus represented the union of the imperial and maritime tribes. As can be seen, the myth features the maritime, feminine, and composite characteristics of the deity, which Nakano deduced from separate sources. The third clan contributing to the Hachiman cult was the Omiwa. Usarangi records a journey by a certain Omiwa from Yamato to Usa, where he arrived about the end of the 6th century. Nakano's theory is that a branch of the Yamato Omiwa was dispatched to Kyushu to help maintain Yamato's grip on the area during a time of trouble both at court, the struggle between the Soga clan and Mononobe clan, and in Korean relations. According to Nakano, the original Omiwa clan of Yamato had close relations with the Ojin Jingui cult, and the Omiwa introduced this cult to Usa. Ojin, incidentally, was the 15th or 16th emperor in the traditional genealogy, depending on whether his mother Jingui is counted as empress or regent. Although Jingui is described in Nihongi as carrying out the conquest of Korea, Ojin appears as a relatively pacific emperor whose only warlike attribute was the fleshy pad on his arm which resembled an archer's arm guard. Perhaps his most notable featuring was to remain in his mother's womb for 12 months while she completed her conquest of Korea. As has been noted above, it is not generally believed that Ojin was associated with the Hachiman cult from its very beginning, but there are various views concerning the origins of this connection. Nakano's explanation as to how and when the link began is not without problems. He admits that the Jingui cult grew up over a wide area of North Kyushu, probably during the 4th to 6th centuries in a context of difficulties with the Korean peninsula, but his premise constrains him to find a specific clan which might have brought the faith to Usa. Another problem is that, as Nakano acknowledges, the only documents relating Hachiman to Ojin date from Heian times. It would be fascinating to speculate about the meaning of the Ojin aspect of the Hachiman belief, especially since some scholars have linked Ojin with the 4th century invasion of Japan from Korea and named him the actual founder of the Japanese imperial institution. Nevertheless, since Shoku Nihongi contains no reference to Hachiman as associated with Ojin, we must conclude that the Nara court's view of Hachiman was not colored by the Ojin cult. For the purposes of the present article, the issue of the date and significance of the Hachiman-Ojin union must thus remain a moot question. In early Nara times, the first reference to Hachiman and Shoku Nihongi is dated Tempayo 9, 737, when offerings were dispatched to 5 shrines on the occasion of friction with Sheila. The Hachiman shrine then proceeded on a meteoric path, gaining in wealth and power until, within the space of about 30 years, the god was called on to make its pronouncement on the imperial succession. Our first problem concerns the court's sudden attention to a previously obscure shrine. Why did Hachiman rise so abruptly to national prominence? A fundamental reason involves the significance of the Usa region itself. Usa is mentioned in Nihongi in connection with the legend of Jimu's drive to the east, the chronicle relating that, during Jimu's campaign, the expedition paused in Usa and was entertained by the local nobility. Then, by imperial command, a princess of the region was married to the emperor's attendant minister, who was an ancestor of the Nakatomi. This passage would seem to indicate an early link of some sort with the Yamato court, or at least that Usa was an important local center. More significant was Usa's position in regard to the importation of continental culture, a coastal area in northern Kyushu with a good harbor. It was certainly in an excellent position to receive and transmit new cultural impulses to the court. There is in fact evidence that the Buzen region was known at Nara for a unique and powerful religious culture, tinged with Buddhism from an early period. Nihongi, for example, records that in 587, a priest from Toyokuni was invited to court. In the early 7th century, an Usa priest named Horan, who was renowned for his healing abilities, visited the court and was rewarded by the emperor. Nakano holds that there was a difference between the Miko of Buzen and those from elsewhere in Japan. The unique quality of the Buzen religion, he suggests, was due to its combination of Korean, Buddhist, and native beliefs, and it was perceived at Nara as potent magic. The location of Usa and its peculiar and prestigious religious forms were the broader reasons for the rise to national attention of the Hachiman cult, but there were more specific factors. One of these was a growing integration of Kyushu into national political life as a result of the centralizing trends of the Taika and Taiho reforms. The Taiho Code provided that appointment to the post of Dazai Sochi, Governor General of Kyushu, entailed advancement to the 3rd rank, and its holder ranked just below the Chunagon and the political hierarchy. The position was thus valuable to a clan striving for supremacy at court, and in fact the Fujiwara gained possession of the post in 732. In that year, one of Fujiwara Fuhito's sons, Machimero, the Dainagon, was appointed to serve concurrently as Dazai Sochi. The Sochi's area of responsibility included the administration of Kyushu shrines. A second factor was the role of the Hachiman shrine during the Hayato disturbances which troubled Kyushu, particularly from the Wado, 708-714, to Yoro, 717-723, periods. The most important event was a Hayato rising in Asumi and Hyuga in 720. Shoku Nihongi records that this rebellion occurred and that it was suppressed, but makes no reference to Hachiman. Other Nara documents, however, note in their report of the incident that prayers were made at the Hachiman shrine and that the priests led a divine army to subjugate the Hayato. One scholar concludes from this that the Dazaifu prayed to Hachiman in wartime as an important local deity. It was in fact to Hachiman as a war god that the Nara court made its first appeals. As noted above, in Tempayo 9, offenses on the part of Sheila were reported to the Hachiman shrine. Actually, the text mentions the 2 shrines, a reference to both the Hachiman shrine proper and that of Imegami, the attendant female deity, as well as to 4 other major shrines. 3 years later, the occasion for prayer to Hachiman was a revolt by Fujiwara Hirotsugu, Hirotsugu had been the governor of Yamato, but 2 years before had been demoted to the post of Dazai Shoni, vice-governor of Kyushu, as a result of factional struggles at court. In 740, he raised a revolt and in response the court issued an edict to the general Azumabito ordering him to pray to Hachiman. Azumabito then led about 15,000 troops against Hirotsugu, who tried to flee to Shila, but was forced back by storms, captured, and executed. In the following year, the Shokuni Hongi records, gifts of land, servants, horses, and Buddhist sutras were made to the shrine and a pagoda was built, presumably in thanksgiving for the subjugation of Hirotsugu. Thus the court's first appeals to Hachiman were made in time of war, yet Hirotsugu's revolt was the last instance in the Nara period in which such prayers were addressed to Hachiman, and so we can hardly conclude that the war god aspect was the primary significance of the deity during this period. Nor do these early prayers to Hachiman shed much light on the god's later importance in the Dokyo incident. We can summarize by observing that the importance of the Usa region, its unique religious forms, and its growing contact with Yamato helped propel Hachiman to the court's attention, and that the court first regarded Hachiman at least in part as a war god, but further developments in other areas must be described in order to provide the proper context for the story of Dokyo's intervention in government. Hachiman and the construction of the Daibutsu, the large Buddha in Nara, the construction of Todaiji, its Daibutsu, and the attendant system of provincial monasteries and nunneries was a chapter of major significance in Nara history. James Murdoch observed, "It has often struck us that an ingenious writer might well contrive to mass a fairly complete account of 8th century Japan around the story of this Nara Daibutsu, for in one way or another it appears to come into contact with almost every phase of the contemporary national activity. However, our principal interest lies in the fact that it was Hachiman's divine aid in the construction of the Daibutsu, which brought the Shinto deity into intimate association with the imperial institution, and which catapulted it from the ranks of regional gods to the status of the most revered divinity in Japan. Although we cannot attempt a full account of the political events which formed the background for the construction of the Daibutsu, we must describe briefly the factional strife which immediately preceded it. The most important aspect of the situation seems to have been a hiatus in Fujiwara power and the entry to court of a Buddhist party. The Fujiwara ancestor Nakatomi no Kumatari, who had come to power in the events of the Taika period, had married his grandchildren into the imperial family, and Emperor Shomu had not only a Fujiwara mother, but also a Fujiwara wife. Both mother and wife were daughters of Fuhito, and the ascent of Shomu to the throne, and the designation of his Fujiwara wife as Empress Komyo, aided in the establishment of Fujiwara hegemony in the period from about 729 to 733. The most powerful figures in the Fujiwara clan were Fuhito's 4 sons, one of whom, Machimaro, we have noted serving as dainagon and concurrently as Dazai Sochi. The newly established Fujiwara power was not to last. In 735 reports reached the court that an epidemic was raging in Kyushu and by 737 the plague had penetrated to Nara. Despite the court's order that sutras be read throughout the country as a prophylactic measure, many of the nobility, including Fuhito's 4 sons, succumbed to the plague. Significantly, however, the emperor did not fall ill, and one imperial prince, who had been stricken, recovered. This was attributed to the ministrations of the Sojo, abbot, Gembo, and the abbot's success aided his political fortunes enormously. The Fujiwara control had been greatly weakened, and in the aftermath of the catastrophe, Tachibana no Moro emerged as the head of government, holding the title dainagon and later Sadaijin. Gembo was closely associated with Moro and was one of the leading forces in the Tachibana clique. A priest of the Hoso school, Gembo had studied in China for 18 years, and he is credited with establishing upon his return the Nai Dojo, an imitation of the Tang office of Buddhist priests serving in the palace. The Nai Dojo was the first permanent institutional entry that Buddhism gained to the imperial palace, and it was to be a key factor in the later rise of Dokyo. Thus with the hiatus in Fujiwara authority a Buddhist party became an influential political force at court. The construction of the system of provincial temples may have been to some degree due to Gembo's instigation, although Gyoki was certainly more closely associated with the Daibutsu project. But Shomu personally was likely the major force behind the temple's establishment. Although the seeds for such a system had been sown in the previous century when Temu ordered Buddhist images placed in houses throughout the provinces, Shomu laid the actual foundation of the network in 728. In that year he ordered 10 scrolls of the Konkomyo Sutra, that is, the Golden Light Sutra, dispatched to each province to have them read for the peace of the nation. The doctrine which undergirded the system was the belief that the guardian kings would protect those countries which revered the Buddhist teachings. Then, in 741, an edict was proclaimed. In each province a monastery and nunnery were to be erected, the former to be called Konkomyo, Shiteno, Gakoku, no Terra and the latter Hok, Genzei, no Terra. The collective term for the system was Kokubunji. Each temple was assigned sustenance land and the sutras were to be read every month for the peace of the people and the protection of the nation. Then, in 743, an edict was issued ordering the construction of a great image of Vairochana Buddha at Todaiji, which was to be the capstone of the Kokubunji system. Shomu had previously previously visited a temple in Kochi where he had viewed a statue of Vairochana Buddha, the Great Sun Buddha, which had been built as a result of spontaneous communal action. The factional strife at court probably weighed heavily on Shomu's mind as he ordered the image built, for his edict called for the cooperation of all, mutually taking counsel, in order that all might attain enlightenment. To that end the monk Yogi began to make his rounds to solicit contributions, no matter how humble, from the common people. The hierarchical network of temples itself probably contributed to a greater awareness of the ideal of state centralization. Todaiji in the capital, with its system of lesser provincial temples, was associated with the symbolism of the Daibutsu, Great Buddha itself. The Buddha was enthroned on a great lotus, upon whose petals sat miniature Buddhas. After numerous failures, the casting of the Daibutsu was accomplished in 749. Although the final dedication was not made until 752, the success of the casting was marked by a great ceremony at Todaiji, which Shomu, now the retired emperor, Komyo, and their daughter Koken, the reigning empress, all attended. An edict was read, thanking Hachiman for his aid in awarding the god the highest court rank. Precisely how Hachiman was thought to have helped in the undertaking is not clear. Nakano believes it had to do with the discovery of gold for the gilding in Matsu, and there is evidence that the Usa Shrine sent large monetary contribution for the project. At any rate, the Shokuni Hongi record demonstrates the extraordinary reverence shown at Todaiji to this previously obscure god, and it is clear that Hachiman was receiving increased attention from the capital. In 745 offerings were made to the Usa Shrine and 7 images of the Yakashi Buddha were erected there. The occasion was an illness of the emperor and offerings were made to many other shrines as well. 3 years later, promotions of Usa Shrine officials were announced. First, 2 shrine maidens of the Omiwa clan were raised from the 8th rank to the 5th. Then, in 749, one of these women, the Neji, priestess, Omiwa Morime and the Kanzukasa, shrine official, Omiwa Tomero were both granted the Kabane of Asan. The reason for the promotions is not stated, although it may well have been thanks for Hachiman's divine aid to the Daibutsu project, for which the god himself was rewarded about a month afterward. Later that year the report reached Nara that the great god Hachiman had announced that he would proceed to the capital. Accordingly, courtiers were dispatched to aid in the journey, and they were men of relatively high rank, a Sangi of the 4th rank and his retainer of the 5th. Moreover, 100 soldiers were called out in each province adjoining the route to escort the god. The killing of living things was prohibited in those provinces. Wine and meat were not to be consumed by the escorts, and the route was to be kept clean of defilement. After about a month, the god and his attendants approached the capital. To welcome them, about 100 courtiers were dispatched. Half of them were of the 5th rank and 20 were from the various guard units in the capital. Hachiman was enshrined in a newly constructed hall, and 40 priests carried out the Buddhist rite of repentance there for a week. At the end of the month, the great ceremony was held at Todaiji, and Shokuni Hongi records it as follows. The nun and priestess of the great god Hachiman, Asanomi Morime, worshipped at Todaiji. Her palanquin was of a purple color, like that of the imperial palanquin. The empress and the retired emperor and empress also proceeded to the temple. On this day, great numbers of government officials and various members of the aristocracy all gathered at the temple. 5,000 priests prayed, performed ceremonies of veneration of the Buddha, and read sutras. The music of Great Tang, Palhi, and Wu and the Gosashi and Kume dances were performed. Then the great god Hachiman was awarded the 1st rank, and Himegami the 2nd. Sadaijin Tachibanamoro presented an edict and read it to the god. The sovereign emperor proclaims, saying, in a recent year, we worshipped the Roshana Buddha at Chishikiji in the Agata district of Kochi. Because we desired to construct such an image and yet were unable to do so, we appealed to the great god Hachiman of the Broadways who dwells in the Usa district of Buzen province. The god said, we, leading and inviting the gods of heaven and earth, shall certainly accomplish this thing. We will turn water into steam for the casting. We will merge our body with the grass, trees and earth. It shall be done without hindrance. Because of the proclamation of the kami, we were overjoyed, and we have been able to accomplish this work. And now, although it is with awe and trepidation, we confer a cap of the 1st rank. The nun and kami medium, Morime, was awarded the junior 4th rank, lower grade. Her brother, Omiwa Tomero, who was chief priest at Usa Hachiman Shrine, was awarded the outer junior 5th rank, lower grade. 4,000 sustenance households, 100 male servants, and 100 female servants were bestowed on Todaiji. Also, those involved in building the temple were given rank according to their labor. Here we should emphasize again the precipitous nature of the rise in the court's esteem for Hachiman. Hachiman, who had received no notice in the first official histories compiled in the Nara period, and who was the recipient of offerings from the court for the first time in 737, ascended in the space of little over a decade to the position of the most revered native god in Japan. By 750 the priestess of Usa held the 4th court rank, while the highest official of the shrine of Amaterasu Atise remained in the 5th. It is not surprising, then, that the shrine continued its close association with affairs at court. In the year after the casting of the Daibutsu, the Usa Shrine received large grants of rank land and sustenance households. In 756, upon the fatal illness of the retired Emperor Shomu, offerings were again dispatched to the Hachiman shrine. But perhaps the most significant feature in the history of the shrine during the decade between the Todaiji ceremony and the beginning of Dokyo's rise to power was the increasing political link between the capital and Usa. In 750 a rescript was issued at court announcing a promotion of Fujiwara Otomero from the senior 5th rank to the junior 3rd and appointing him to the post of Dazai Sochi. This, said the proclamation, was done according to the instruction of the great god Hachiman. There are a number of important points here. First, Otomero was the brother of Nakamero, who at this time was the driving force behind the reassertion of the clan's power at court. Second, we should note the importance which factions at Nara attached to the post of Dazai Sochi. We have seen an earlier Fujiwara serving concurrently as Dainagon and Dazai Sochi. Finally, we should remark on the use of Hachiman in legitimizing an appointment to political office. Unfortunately, nothing is known of the details of the Usa medium's trances and pronouncements, whether, like the Pythia at Delphi, she chewed laurel leaves, or prophesied while seated on a tripod. It is apparent, however, that the Kanzukasa, in this case, Omiwa Otomero, served as an interpreter of the words of the medium, Omiwa Morime, and hence had a great power over these pronouncements. Thus the elevation of Otomero at precisely the time that his brother was reasserting Fujiwara power should raise our suspicions, and it is not a great surprise to find, in the year 755, a notice in the Shoku Nihongi, that Tomero and a priest of Yakushiji in Nara conspired together and practiced sorcery. The details of the plot are not given, but as a result both Tomero and Morime were stripped of their court rank and exiled. The position of Kanzukasa reverted to the Usa clan, and in the following year Hachiman delivered a fascinating oracle. We do not desire that false pronouncements be made of our will. There is no use for the excess lands and households that have been received, and they are as though abandoned on a mountain. They should be returned to the court, and only the permanent shrine land should be retained in the decade preceding Dokyo's rise to power. Then, there were increasing links between Usa and Nara. A Fujiwara's promotion was dictated by an oracle from Usa, and a shrine official conspired with a Nara priest. Although the conspiracy at the shrine was exposed, a precedent had been set for Hachiman's will to be used as a sanction for rise to political office. We have remarked on the Fujiwara resurgence during this period, and we should give an outline of the political events of the 750s. The reassertion of Fujiwara power began with the illness and retirement of Emperor Shomu and the accession of his daughter Koken in 749. The real power, however, lay with the retired empress, Shomu's Fujiwara wife Komyo. Soon after Koken's enthronement, Komyo changed the name of her household office to Shibi-Chudai. She appointed her nephew Fujiwara Nakamero as its head, and he began a reorganization, which was to make the office the most powerful organ of government in the 750s. The nominal head of government was Sadaijin Tachibana no Moro, but as Nakamero's power waxed, that of Moro waned. In 755 he was forced from office, and a planned revolt by his son 2 years later was thwarted. After Shomu's death in 757, Nakamero and Komyo were left without effective rivals for power. They set aside the prince whom Shomu had designated as heir to Koken and made Prince Oi, to whom Nakamero had married his daughter, crown prince in his stead. In 758 Koken was forced to abdicate and Prince Oi took the throne as Emperor Junin. He was to be nothing more than a puppet of Nakamero, who received new grants of land and the name Iemai Oshikatsu. In 760 Oshikatsu was awarded the first rank, junior grade, which not even his grandfather Fuhito or his father Muchamero had been able to attain. But his triumph was short-lived, for later in the year his main pillar of support, Empress Dowager Komyo, died. Until this time there had been no great friction between the retired Empress Koken and the Nakamero Komyo party. With the death of her mother, however, Koken was to assert herself. In 761, while Koken was residing at the detached palace of Horinomi, she fell ill and was attended by the priest Dokyo. In the following year she returned to Nara and issued a decree announcing that henceforth she would deal with all important matters of state. Although he did not actually abdicate, Junin took priestly vows and retired to a temple.